Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. And I have to say, this panel could not be more timely. We have a new administration and we have a new approach toward Iran. Iranian officials, as you all know, have expanded their nuclear program outside the limits of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But they have said repeatedly they will go back into compliance if the US does, and if the US lifts sanctions imposed by the Trump administration after it unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018. Now, this seems fairly straightforward, but there obviously are some complexities, and they're caused by the different authorities that the Trump administration used to impose all of those sanctions. So we have a terrific panel. I want to get right to it because we only have 1 hour. And I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. Brian O'Toole is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global Business and Economics program. He's a former senior advisor at the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control. And he's written an excellent paper for us on this topic, which I hope you've all read. Brian will go first, then we're going to go to Kenneth Katzman, a longtime Iran, Persian Gulf, and sanctions expert at the Congressional Research Service, then to Kelsey Davenport, Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, and finally to Ali Vaez, the Iran Project Director and Senior Advisor to the President of the International Crisis Group. So Brian, I'm going to start with you. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has said on a couple of occasions that President Joe Biden could lift Iran sanctions with 3 executive orders. So my question is, could Biden do that? And if not, why not?
Yeah, mechanically, he certainly can. It's
axing. And what are
they? Yeah, it's axing 2 of the ones that that Trump put in kind of post JCPOA withdrawal, and then the executive order that Trump signed to essentially effect the JCPOA withdrawal and reimpose all the U.S. sanctions. What Zarif, though, is purposefully ignoring in that are all of these sanctions that the Trump administration imposed that would very well have been legitimate targets, and in a hypothetical world may have also been imposed by a President Hillary Clinton during the last several years. So the paper seeks to kind of address those issues to some degree, because saying, the U.S. will rejoin the JCPOA and come back into compliance if Iran does is a good talking point, but it's a heck of a lot more complicated than that, both mechanically and politically. So politically, the issues that I kind of lay out in the paper are, there are, of course, sanctions that violate U.S. commitments under the 2015 deal. There are kind of a myriad of those, but the most kind of obvious one for the Iranians are secondary sanctions on the oil sales, right? That's in large part the relief that Iran seeks. So that's, there are clearly sanctions that need to be lifted. But then you get into questions about how are you going to slice things up from 2017 onward, and that's where you get into the other buckets that I've put forward, and the most kind of critical are the poison pill ones. That last bucket of sanctions, the terrorism designations against the Central Bank of Iran, the National Iranian Tanker Company, and the National Iranian Oil Company. And those are really kind of critical, because even if you lift sanctions in compliance with U.S. commitments under the JCPOA itself, the terrorism designation basically continues secondary sanctions regardless of the lifting in that deal that the U.S. agreed to. So you have to deal with the terrorism piece there. For NITSE and NIOC, the linkages aren't quite as direct as the Central Bank of Iran. I think the challenge the Biden administration is going to face is, what do you do with the central bank? Because it is undeniable that the Central Bank of Iran funds Hezbollah, which is a terrorist group. And therefore, the terrorism designation is logically justifiable. And so you can generally license away essentially the secondary sanctions that apply to CBI and try to address it that way. It's unclear whether that's going to be acceptable to the Iranians, who may demand kind of formal lifting of those sanctions. The lifting could be done. There is, authority to do that. From just kind of the bureaucratic perspective, there isn't any hurdle there. The question then is going to be, is that a fight the Biden administration, or Biden administration and Tony Blinken, probably most most in the crosshairs, is going to want to have with Congress.
Well, could Congress do anything to stop it if the U.S. says that this is in U.S. national interest and uses the loopholes that are there to do that?
Well, I wouldn't call them loopholes. Waivers are there for a reason. And they are certainly justifiable in legislation. I think Congress could try to trigger INARA again, the Iran Review Act, and force another vote, depending on whatever kind of deal the Biden administration comes up with. I think what may end up happening, in part because there's some speculation that the Iranian election may be kind of a black period for actually executing any sort of deal. You might start to see some phased relief, where there are some waivers issued for oil sales to countries significantly reducing. And that the Trump administration has tried to drive Iran's oil revenues and exports down to zero. That, of course, has failed. They are producing and selling more oil than they were a year ago. But if you introduce some of those waivers and allow sales to Germany, to India, to South Korea, folks that were importing before, you can actually tie that money up using other pieces of sanctions, the National Defense Authorization Act from 2012, I believe, to tie those funds up in those foreign jurisdictions. I've written about this before as well, so that you're not having this barter arrangement with Venezuela where you actually have money moving to people you really don't want it to go to. So I think that may be kind of where this moves going forward. But back to kind of Zarif's point, like, yes, they could lift the sanctions by revoking those 3 executive orders. They would also have to, by the way, transfer 1,000 or so entities from the SDN list to an EO 13599 list, which bureaucratically takes a fair amount of time, because the paperwork to do that is, as silly as that sounds, paperwork takes a long time.
How long would it take?
It all depends on what you do with the post-Trump sanctions. If you revoke all of them, you're just delisting, and that's relatively easy. But if you're going to slice and dice it, you've got to make a decision on all those entities, right? And they designated hundreds of individuals and entities. And so, having to draw up new packages, having to get those legally reviewed, that all could take months, to accomplish, just from a bureaucratic perspective, period.
Yeah. Let me ask you one other follow-up, and then we'll go on to Ken. And this is a question that came to me just this morning. And this is a question about the USA Patriot Act, Section 311, which designates Iran as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. This rule is now final. How difficult would it be to deal with this particular problem? And how much help would it be if the Iranian government finally approved the legislation that's been sitting around for a long time against money laundering and terrorism financing, the so-called FATF, or foreign
Financial Action Task Force.
Financial Action Task.
Yeah. So
FATF rules that have been sitting around waiting in Tehran for approval for a couple of years.
Yeah. So the Patriot Act 311 designation is essentially the U.S.'s way of imposing countermeasures under the FATF recommendations. And so when FATF lists a country on its blacklist, the end result essentially is that members of FATF should take countermeasures with respect to that jurisdiction. And so the 311 essentially implements that, and it's another hurdle out there for Iran. And it's arguable that in the kind of 2015, 2016 to 2017 period, one of the reasons Iran didn't see the sanctions relief it hoped to was in no small part because of FATF blacklisting. Uncertainty over Trump, of course, played into that as well in the election. But the FATF blacklisting may have been the kind of biggest issue. Mechanically, the US can and has in the past with respect to Burma, Myanmar, um, kind of obviated the FATF slash 311 effects via general license from OFAC. But I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case here. I think unless Iran can get itself off the blacklist, the 311 sticks, and similar measures in other countries will stick as well. And it will be a significant issue for the Iranians in trying to gain the economic benefits they want to see out of this relief.
Great. That's very helpful. Ken, let me come to you. You've had a chance to read Brian's paper. I want your comment on how he's categorized the different buckets of sanctions, and how hard or easy it would be to lift them, and also your view on whether there are some interim steps. We've had this ridiculous conversation in social media and even some of the mainstream press, where the US says Iran has to go first and come back into compliance, and Iran says the US has to go first and come back into compliance, when in fact, both sides are probably going to have to move. So, what are some of the steps that the Biden administration could take that would indicate goodwill?
Yeah.
Emergency IMF loan for COVID, easier humanitarian trade. And what about the idea that Brian suggested for restoring some oil waivers, say, as an interim step, while Iran itself also starts to return to compliance with the nuclear deal?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for having me today. I am in a CRS capacity today, for what it's worth, better or worse. Anyway, again, the paper roughly comported with my analysis too. I would say there is a broad principle in the discussion of terrorism designations, as was mentioned, the central bank, Bank Markazi, being designated a terrorist entity. I note there was also the Mubarak steel plant was designated a terrorist entity. Various Iranian banks were designated as terrorist entities. And so I think there's a broad principle at play here that needs to be discussed, which is the principle of declaring economic entities as terrorist entities. Now, the whole premise of the JCPOA basically was we recognize that Iran is funding armed factions in the region that have carried out acts of terrorism. But the idea is, it was so important to limit Iran's nuclear capability that there was a determination that Iran's economy would be allowed to operate freely in the international economic system, again, despite Iran's aid to these armed factions, because it was in our interest to curb the nuclear program. And that still is really the central principle. And I would say, basically any Iranian entity that was designated by the Trump administration as a terrorism entity under Executive Order 13224, I would assess that probably those terrorism designations are going to have to be revoked. Whether or not we determine that the money generated by those entities is indeed going to those armed factions, because I can, without being in Tehran or speaking to a single Iranian official, I can tell you, unless Iran's central bank is going to be allowed to again freely operate in the international banking system, Iran is not going to accept returning to compliance with the JCPOA. The central bank is the hub of Iran's international banking activity, international financial activity. All of Iran's money overseas, now it's down to maybe 90 billion, 80 billion. They've drawn down the assets a little bit. At the time of the JCPOA, they had about 125 billion overseas. It's now a little less. There's about 7 billion in South Korea that's become a focus of a dispute between Iran and South Korea. All those accounts are central bank accounts. Those are Iran's central bank accounts in foreign banks abroad. And Iran needs to be able to move that money around if it's going to be successful in economically. And so Iran is certainly going to insist that CBI designation, and I would say any oil entity, oil export, petrochemical export banking entity that was designated as a terrorist entity, Iran is going to demand that those terrorism designations be revoked, notwithstanding any determination about where that money ultimately is going on the part of when Iran earns it. Now, in terms of, you mentioned, I've also toyed around with the idea of interim steps. As Mr. Blinken said, Secretary, it is going to take time. The United States is demanding Iran go first. Iran is demanding the opposite. It is going to take time. So there are some what I would call signaling moves the United States can do. We've talked about this significant reduction exceptions for oil sales. Those could be waived without a broader deal. At any time. It could be selective. Certain countries could be given the exception and allowed to start buying Iranian oil again. Certain other countries, such as China, could be denied that waiver. And so that there is a selectivity that could be applied. The asset lockup, under the Iran Threat Reduction Act, Iran's money is essentially restricted in the accounts where they are located. So, for example, $7 billion in South Korea has to stay in South Korea. Iran can buy humanitarian goods in South Korea, but they have to be South Korean goods. The money has to stay there. So that is a waiver that could be exercised selectively to allow Iran to draw down certain assets in certain countries and not others. Then you do have the issue of the international banking system, the US banking system. South Korea, there was, Iran wanted to take its $7 billion to buy vaccines. We're talking about vaccines, medicines. They wanted to be able to use that $7 billion to buy goods that they need to deal with the pandemic. And the United States did issue a license, but Iran didn't want any of the money having to go through the US financial system to be converted into dollars, because if it's in the international US financial system for even a minute, Iran was afraid the Trump administration would seize the assets. So there is the problem of non-access to the US financial system, which is going to have to at some point probably be discussed and resolved. I would say the issue of nuclear waivers is first and foremost. The European countries were very upset when the Trump administration revoked the nuclear waivers for them to do work in Iran's permitted facilities that Iran is operating under the Jcpoa. The Trump administration revoked those waivers, and the European companies cannot work in Iran without penalty. I would say, reissuing those waivers would be something the Europeans would look to as a gesture that the United States is going to move back into the JCPOA and is interested in resuming its commitments under the JCPOA. There's an Iraq waiver that could be expanded for Iraq to continue to buy Iranian gas and electricity. You mentioned the IMF loan. Iran has an active application for $5 billion to the IMF for money that they say they need for the COVID pandemic. The Trump administration basically blocked that loan. The Biden administration could, even in the advance of returning to the JCPOA, could decide to support that loan, and Iran would get that money. We have the issue of Instex hanging out there, which is a European special trading vehicle that was set up, and it only completed basically one transaction. The Trump administration called it a European effort to undermine US sanctions, undermine maximum pressure, so it wasn't used. The Biden administration could easily shift policy if it wanted to and say, we support Instex, we support using that vehicle. Even before all the other sanctions are lifted, we support using that vehicle so that Iran can buy medical supplies, let's say, to deal with the pandemic or other things. So there are a number of steps that could be taken as gestures to Iran, even in advance of rejoining the JCPOA, if the administration wanted to go in that direction. That's obviously up to them.
Thank you. That's a fantastic list. And you also managed to answer one of the questions that I see people are already putting in the Q&A box at the bottom of their screens. And this was specifically a question about what the Europeans could do. So definitely the instacts, the nuclear waivers, those are two things that Europe certainly could do, which would be very, very helpful. I'm going to turn now to what the Iranians need to do to get back into compliance with this deal. And there is new news. Alas, alack, there was a statement from Iran's Atomic Energy Organization just this morning that in less than 3 months, Iran has already installed 1,000 IR2 centrifuges. These are slightly more advanced than the so-called IR1 centrifuges that Iran had been using. We do know that Iran has been moving out of compliance steadily over the last couple of months. Iran has started to produce uranium enriched to near 20% levels. So Kelsey, how complicated is it now for Iran to return to JCPOA compliance, and what's a likely timeline? One other is can we get back to sort of the 12-month breakout period that had been established by the JCPOA, the time in which it would take Iran to develop enough fissile material for a single weapon, given all the progress that Iran has made on advanced centrifuges? Can we get back under that?
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And thanks so much to the Atlantic Council for hosting this and for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And my congratulations to Brian on what I think is a very useful paper for thinking about the sanctions aspect. But to get back to Iran's nuclear program and your question, I mean, when looking at the violations that Iran has taken to date and are planning to take in the next few months, I mean, I think it's useful to divide them into sort of two camps. I mean, first, we have the activities that Iran has reconstituted that it was engaged in prior to the JCPOA. And then second, we have sort of the new body of work that's really resulted in sort of new knowledge and new expertise for Iran that's more difficult to reverse. Now, fortunately, to date, most of Iran's violations fall within that first category, activities that Iran had undertaken prior to the JCPOA being implemented. And that includes, a larger stockpile of enriched uranium, enrichment to 20%, enrichment at Fordo, and the production of heavy water. So certainly these violations of the deal are concerning. And they have impacted the breakout time, as you said. When the breakout time is commonly understood as the amount of time it would take for Iran to produce enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon. And when the JCPOA was fully implemented, that was about 12 months. Now, as a result of these violations, the increased number of centrifuges, the larger stockpile, the higher levels of enrichment, I mean, that timeline is probably down to about 3 months. But all of these activities are quickly reversible. So it's possible to get back to that 12-month timeline. And again, because Iran had conducted these activities before, Iran hasn't really gained anything in the long term in terms of knowledge and expertise. So while concerning, like I said, I think these activities are easily dealt with. And Iran could probably restore, compliance with the deal, in less than 3 months if it was motivated to do so. Now, it's the second bucket of activities that I think are much more concerning. And these are the breaches that Iran has conducted that have really resulted in them gaining some type of new knowledge or expertise or aren't reversible. And to date, Iran has taken, a significant step in terms of testing advanced centrifuges and enriching uranium with advanced centrifuges in excess of what the deal permits. And the knowledge that Iran has gained from operating these advanced centrifuge machines, in cascades and producing uranium with them, this knowledge, of course, is not reversible. I mean, Iran can easily dismantle the machines and put them, and come back into compliance with the limits on advanced centrifuges, but they've gained something that, that we can't reverse. Now, in terms of assessing the impact that this has, Iran is testing a wide array of advanced centrifuge models. I think, 9 or 10 at less camp, possibly more. So to me, that signals that Iran hasn't really, decided on a successor sort of advanced centrifuge. I would be more concerned if they were kind of putting all of their efforts sort of into one machine. So when we look at, the number of machines, the number of models that have been tested, a relatively small number of machines, this knowledge that Iran has gained, the machines they've produced, I mean, this could have a slight impact on the breakout time if we restore the JCPOA. But I don't view it at this point as a game changer or anything that should change the US calculus in terms of restoring the JCPOA. I mean, you noted the announcement on 1,000, IR2M centrifuges. Iran had installed 1,000 IR2M centrifuges, before the JCPOA was negotiated. If they get to the point where they install the 1,000 IR6 centrifuges, which are a more advanced model that Iran and a step Iran is required to take under its nuclear legislation from December of 2020, if they do that, then that starts to have kind of more of a risk, because this isn't a model that Iran has installed and tested at the same level of the IR2Ms. So that's a concern. Just as concerning too, I think, are other steps that Iran may take in 2021 to meet the requirements of this nuclear legislation that was passed in December. Namely, we know Iran is starting to install equipment necessary to convert uranium into a metallic form. Iran says this is to produce fuel for the Tehran research reactor. But not only is this a violation of the JCPOA, but if Iran actually gets to the point where it's producing uranium metal, this would be a new knowledge and capability that is relevant to weapons development. So even though their intention right now is to produce fuel, that would still, I think, impact sort of their overall weaponization capabilities. And this isn't something they've done before. We know from Iran's past nuclear weapons activities that when they had a program, prior to 2003, that they looked into this, that they may have done some tests with other types of materials. But if they're actually producing that uranium metal, that's a new capability.
Yeah.
Similarly, I'm very concerned about what may happen in late February, when Iran is threatening to reduce compliance with International Atomic Energy inspectors. They've made very clear that they will continue to abide by their NPT required safeguards, so there'll still be an inspector presence there, but some of that more intrusive monitoring and verification will be lost. And if that's lost, even if it's just for a short gap of time, it can be difficult to reconstitute, exactly what Iran may have done sort of during that period. So again, looking at what Iran has already done, I would say, it's reversible. It's not a game changer. But if we look at the steps that Iran is planning to undertake in the next few months, I think those are much more serious. So to me, that underscores that it's quite urgent that the Biden administration, move quickly to try and restore compliance with the deal, to head off these more troubling steps that have longer term implications in terms of proliferation risk, because of that knowledge and expertise just isn't reversible.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the questions in the Q&A is about also the fact that Iran is having presidential elections in June, and that, as we know, the current president and foreign minister and negotiators would likely change after those elections. So it would certainly become more complicated to try to get back into the deal if the US has to negotiate with an entirely new cast of characters, and possibly people who don't speak English so well and who are not so predisposed to trying to get back into the deal. I'm going to turn to Ali now. There are questions that I'm getting about Iran's regional activities, which I think are most likely something that would be discussed in parallel with any JCPOA talks. But I also wanted to ask you just about leverage in general, Ali, because as Brian has pointed out, as others have pointed out, Iran has actually managed to increase its oil exports despite sanctions. Maximum pressure started to wane even before our November elections, and certainly after that, when the Iranians realized that they wouldn't have to deal with Donald Trump anymore. So what is US leverage now over Iran's nuclear program and other activities? What's in it for them? Could domestic politics and hardliner ambitions to take over the presidency prevent a return by Iran to the JCPOA, even if the US starts to lift sanctions or agrees to lift sanctions? And also, you had an idea, you wrote about this, I think, in a recent piece for the crisis group, that that Joe Biden should start by lifting the May 2018 executive order leaving the JCPOA, and then Iran could suspend implementation of that very troublesome legislation that Kelsey was talking about, and we could have a phased approach of compliance for compliance. So, Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for the invitation. Let me start by also recommending to everyone to read Brian's really excellent report I'm particularly hoping that the Iranians would read it to get a better sense of the difficulties in sanctions relief. In 2012, I had a conversation with Iran's chief nuclear negotiator at the time, Saeed Jalili, and I walked away from that discussion shocked by the level of miscomprehension on the side of Iranians in terms of the difficulties of sanctions relief. And at the time, we had obviously international sanctions, multilateral sanctions, and unilateral sanctions. But Brian's, and that's why I wrote a report in 2013 called the Spider Web, which basically was a description of the difficulty and the sticky nature of sanctions, and drew a lot on reports that Ken has written on this subject over the years as well. But Brian's report is an excellent update to challenges that we are facing in the coming weeks. Look, there are two groups of skeptics in Iran. The first have an economic argument. They say the Iranian economy is just starting to adjust to maximum pressure sanctions. Inflation is going down. There is a little bit of economic growth. IMF and World Bank and others are predicting that the Iranian economy will start to grow, even, albeit at a very low level, but it is going to turn towards growth. They say, why should we subject the economy to even a positive shock that would still be uncertain? This vacillation of diplomatic vacillations and geostrategic vacillations are really having an adverse effect on the Iranian economy. Right now, for instance, no one in Iran is buying cell phones, buying homes, because they're waiting to see if the currency exchange rate would change and the prices would drop in the coming months. And so the argument is we should just move beyond this linkage between the economic situation in Iran and the diplomatic front. The second argument is more political, and you referred to it, Barbara, by alluding to the upcoming elections. There are some people in Iran who prefer that Rouhani does not manage to revive the Jcpoa and reap the benefits of basically normalizing Iran's economic situation, and would much prefer to wait until there's a new president in place, and the credit for that would be his, not Rouhani's. And they also are concerned about the electoral implications of economic reprieve prior to the elections, out of fear that this might strengthen the hands of the more moderate forces of Iranian politics. But I think there are counter arguments to both of these, and that's why I'm cautiously optimistic that the Iranians would move in the right direction. The counter argument to the economic skeptics is that, yes, Iranian economy has proven that it can survive, but there is one thing that is certain, that it cannot thrive under sanctions. And this is extremely costly to the Iranian economy. And this is partly, I think, where the US's leverage comes in. But my argument, countering those who say that we shouldn't give away the whole leverage, and then Iranians would have no interest in negotiating a follow-on agreement on the nuclear front or a broader agreement on missiles and regional, is that the US's leverage is not in the form of Trump sanctions, but in the now proven ability of the United States to turn this switch on and off on its own to great effect on the Iranians. And so that leverage is going to be there 2 years down the road if we cannot negotiate a follow-on agreement with the Iranians. And to counter the political argument, I think the hardliners can actually share the credit in case sanctions are lifted prior to the elections, because they can now say it was because of the leverage that they created through their legislation that the US was forced to provide Iran with sanctions relief. Whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter, but they can share in the credit. And second, I think the Supreme Leader in one of his speeches on December 16th basically put an end to this debate about the timeline by saying that if sanctions could be lifted, there should not be even an hour of delay. And this is because I think he wants the current president to deal with reviving the Jcpoa, and he doesn't want the next president to be burdened by it. And this is primarily goes back to the fact that in Iran actually the work that Kelsey was describing in terms of getting back into full compliance is considered in Iranian domestic politics dirty work. No one wants to dismantle centrifuges and ship out a stockpile of enriched uranium after everything that they've gone through and sabotage of their nuclear facilities and assassination of their nuclear scientists. That doesn't make you necessarily popular in the domestic stage, and that's why it is much preferred that the lame duck Rouhani administration takes care of this than the successor. Now, on the best path forward, I absolutely agree with what Brian and Ken said in terms of both the time-consuming nature of sanctions relief. We didn't get to the stage that we are now overnight. It took 2.5 years, so we cannot get out of it overnight either. And second, that there are confidence-building measures that could be implemented early on before we get to remove the sanctions. But there is also a necessity to prevent mistrust from becoming even deeper than it is right now, and from the situation spiraling out of control. I'm hearing from the Europeans, for instance, that if on February 21st, Iran withdraws from the additional protocol, that there is quite possible that they would move towards snapping back the UN sanctions. And so it would add an entire layer of complication to the current dynamics. So our suggestion has been that if the president issues an executive order that revokes Trump's executive order of 8 May 2018 and restores US as a participant to the Jcpoa, even if it's still in violation in the same way that Iran is a participant but is in breach of the agreement, it is likely that it would prompt a similar political directive on the Iranian side, probably by the Supreme National Security Council, that would stop the implementation of the Majlis's legislation, and would then empower the president and the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency to start the process of rolling back Iranian breaches in parallel to Secretaries of Treasury and State in the US starting the process of lifting the sanctions, which could be staggered and coordinated in a way that is mutually acceptable by both sides.
That's terrific. Do you know if the Europeans have begun at all to work on any kind of sequencing of steps, or is it just too early days? I mean, our Secretary of State, of course, has only just come in to office, and he's still filling out his team and hopefully naming an Iran envoy fairly soon. But have the Europeans taken any steps in advance, as far as you know, on sequencing?
The difficulty was that because the new administration strongly believed in the principle of one government at a time, they really did not engage in any discussions with the Europeans or anybody else on this matter before they came to office. And the early discussions have been pretty high level, so have been quite general. I don't think we have got to the stage that there is discussion of an exact timetable. And at the end of the day, there is a need for also having a conversation with the Iranians, because they have specific expectations of how sanctions relief should work. Again, part of it based on the incomplete picture that they have, or expectations that are probably misplaced. So there needs to be a discussion with the Iranians as well before the timetable could be developed.
Okay, let me get to some more of the questions which have been absolutely pouring in. I think what you just said about the potential for the Europeans asking for snapback at the UN is quite something. That would certainly give them some additional leverage. Of course, they refused to do that when the Trump administration tried to push them to do that. I've had also some questions about the regional activities of Iran and the fact that the original Jcpoa obviously did not change Iran's regional posture. Iran continued to support a variety of militias and proxies in the region. So I guess the question is, is it enough really? And if not, how does one address these regional issues as well? I know we've all had some suggestions about ways in which to do this, but I'll turn back to you quickly, Ali, and then we'll get to some more of these more economic questions.
Look, I think the simple answer to your question is that if we are unable to get the first step right, which is to revive the Jcpoa, I would argue forget about any other kind of agreement, regional ballistic missile, even a better, stronger, longer nuclear deal. The first step is to revive what we already had, the original agreement based on the original terms. Then, after a few months, there will be a new Iranian president, and there could be discussions about a follow-on nuclear deal. But the question is, how do you conduct a regional discussion? Iran and the US are not going to talk about the region behind the back of regional stakeholders. If you want to have the regional stakeholders also at the table of the P5+1 and Iran, it becomes an impossible negotiation because you would have 13 to 15 countries at the table. Probably I think the best way forward is to look at the regional dimension of this as a regional dialogue process that could be supported by the permanent members of the Security Council. But it would be only the regional countries. And mostly I'm talking about the 6 GCC countries plus Iran and Iraq. And those talks could be organized and convened either by the Secretary General of the UN or by a core group of Scandinavian countries. This is going to be a lengthy process, but I think the best way of understanding how regional diplomacy could work is to understand that this is not necessarily the core bargain that's applied in the JCPOA does not necessarily apply in the regional talks. The core bargain of JCPOA was Iran would give away on its nuclear program, which is not core to its national security, at least since 2003, in return for economic incentives in the form of sanctions relief. Regional countries don't have sanctions on Iran. Regional countries would not be able to compensate Iran on concessions on elements that are core to its security just through financial incentives. So there is a need for arms control discussions at the regional level, threat perceptions at the regional level. And again, that's why it's an entirely different tack of negotiations, which I don't think the United States could lead, but it can definitely support somebody else who's more neutral in this conflict that could help guide these discussions.
That's great. I'm going to turn to some economic and sanctions related questions for Brian and for Ken. This one comes from William Beeman, asks Brian whether OFAC has failed to observe the humanitarian waivers that are supposed to exist under sanctions, and whether under the Biden administration those waivers can be more scrupulously observed. And let me also add to that a question from Dave DeRoche about US court settlements that award damages to victims of terrorism. How would the Biden administration deal with these? I guess if Iran's economy does not pass through the Federal Reserve, if there are no dollars it's not being converted into dollars, I suppose the US can't grab hold of those assets. But let's have you tackle those two, and then I'll go to Ken with one more.
Yeah. So as a former OFACer, I bristle at the idea that OFAC's the one standing in the way of humanitarian waivers. And that is largely because OFAC does not act by itself, right? So OFAC can issue licenses, it can issue, the State Department does the waivers as a technical matter, but OFAC issues the general license that says export of humanitarian style goods, food, medicine, and medical devices is authorized, subject to certain conditions on payment and entities that you can and can't deal with, the terrorism ones that we've talked about. From there, it becomes a kind of larger question of what US policy is. And under the Trump administration, what happened was OFAC has the license that's been outstanding. And they say we would bless transactions if you give us all this information, but you also simultaneously have the State Department traveling around the world saying you can't trust any transaction with Iran because the IRGC might be on the other side of it. And so that policy scares people away. And that's not really OFAC's fault. To make humanitarian transactions work requires a whole of government approach. And I think Congress is looking at the humanitarian world a little bit more carefully. I think the administration probably is as well, as part of the economic sanctions review that Deputy Secretary nominee Wally Adeyemo is going to be instituting, assuming he's confirmed. I think Yellen would probably do it even if Wally isn't confirmed. And that's going to be a real focus on how to make those deliveries happen a little bit better, I think, because it is clear that there are interruptions there, but it's not, I mean, it's not really solely OFAC's fault there. And this plays a little bit into the terrorism judgment question. So the kind of issue of terrorism judgments is outside the purview of a political administration, right? That's something done through the courts, who have awarded substantial damages to victims of Iranian terrorism. The reason that is hugely impactful is because Iran can't really move money around the world without converting into dollars. And this was kind of acutely at issue with the money that was stuck in Oman in the kind of post Jcpoa period, is hugely at issue with the money stuck in South Korea. If they're trying to move that money out of South Korea, there's almost no way to do that without converting first to dollars. And so then it goes through the US at some point, and then it can be claimed by those victims of terrorism, right? So the attachment happens because there's a sitting court order out there on US correspondent banks, that any money coming through that has an interest of the government of Iran needs to be held for payment of these claims. And those claims, because they're awarded under the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, TRIA, there's a little bit of unsettled court opinion, as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it, there's some unsettled jurisdiction, but TRIA is one of the few, if not the only law in the United States that overcomes the National Emergency Authority's use to implement sanctions, right? So there's almost nothing that OFAC can do to even make those transactions happen if they want to, in some ways. So frankly, I think if there's a broader settlement to be had with Iran, the victims' compensation stuff needs to be dealt with, because there's almost no way to move tens or hundreds of billions of dollars around the world for Iran without going to the US at some point. The liquidity in those currencies that Iran wants to use just isn't there. And the only place that exists in the world is the United States.
Ken, I'm going to turn to you on the same question, but also Dan Lieberman has put in the Q&A that the US has defined Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. I think a couple of other countries have as well. And the question is about what proven international terrorism has Hezbollah committed? And what about the many the scientists that have been assassinated in Iran? Has Hezbollah assassinated any scientists lately in Israel? No, as far as I know, that's not the case. So there's a question about the whole politicization of the terrorism label. I mean, just on their way out of office, we saw the Trump administration stick Cuba back on the terrorism list and designate the Houthis as terrorists, which I believe the Biden administration has already said it would review.
Yeah, this is an issue that really, I think, deserves a lot of discussion. I contributed some intellectual capital to a paper that the Soufan Center put out last year called Deconstructing Tehran's Regional Strategy. And what was argued there is to characterize Iran's regional activity as supporting terrorism really misses the point. Iran's strategy is a very sophisticated, intricate strategy of nurturing small, mostly Shia factions into progressively more powerful parties and factions in their own countries that eventually gain a share of power in their countries, as we've seen in Lebanon, Iraq. It's a very sophisticated strategy, and to reduce it to supporting terrorism really completely misses the point, and in many ways prevents you from developing the policies and initiatives that would counter Iran's activities if you take it from a counterterrorism approach only. And so we really need, I'd say, a broader discussion. Now, yes, Hezbollah did commit acts of terrorism, early on in its formation and even maybe beyond that. But now look at what Hezbollah is. I mean, Hezbollah is a kingmaker of sorts in Lebanon. And to reduce it to a terrorist group, I'm not quibbling with what they've done in the past or what they could still do. I'm not, and even as recently assassinating Israelis in Europe and various nefarious activities, blowing up the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. I'm not, nobody would dispute that they did any of these things, but the issue is they are now a very politically powerful force in Lebanon. And that's the way you need to deal with Iran and Hezbollah, not as just Hezbollah being a terrorist group. And so, I think when we look at Iran's regional strategy, we really have to evaluate what Iran is up to. Now, you mentioned malign activities with Ali, and I totally agree. Iran is not going to discuss unilateral restraints on its regional activity. I mean, Iran's view is everybody is interfering in all the places in the Middle East. The United States, Israel, the Gulf states, Egypt, everybody's interfering. And we are not going to be told we can't interfere and everybody else still can interfere. So Iran's position is, if you want to discuss resolving these conflicts that led us to interfere, that's fine. We'll discuss that with you. We may disagree. It may be very difficult to get to an agreement, but we will discuss that. But they will not discuss some unilateral constraints on their ability to interfere, such as might be included in a revised nuclear deal or some such thing.
Yeah, I think Mike Pompeo's 12 demands have left with Mike Pompeo. A couple of questions for you, Kelsey, on the role of Russia and China on the JCPOA. We've talked a little bit about Europe, but what can Russia and China do perhaps to help revive this? And then a reference to a piece that we just put up on the Iran Source blog by Bob Kelly of CIPRI, a nuclear expert who notes that Iran has said that it wants to take the uranium, which is enriched to near 20% levels, turn it into powder, and then make fuel plates for the Tehran research reactor, which produces medical isotopes. And of course, if Iran were to turn it into powder, it couldn't further enrich to the 80 to 90% purity that would be required for nuclear weapons. So Kelly argues that this is actually a proliferation victory if this is the way it goes. I know, Kelsey, you have some different views. So over to you on those two. Oh, and sorry, yes, it's a question also on that from Sahar Naurizadeh. Hi, Sahar. The question is Iran running low on fuel for the Tehran research reactor again? And is that something we might discuss? I recall that when the Obama administration first came in, there was a proposal for Iran to send out its 20% uranium to be turned into fuel for the Tehran research reactor. Now it seems they can make their own.
Thanks, Barbara. Great questions. So perhaps starting with the Tehran research reactor. Now, the Tehran research reactor is used to produce medical isotopes. And under the JCPOA, the parties to the agreement are required to help Iran import in small quantities under IAEA supervision the necessary 20% enriched fuel for the Tehran research reactor. Now, unfortunately, the Trump administration ended waivers allowing those imports to continue in 2020. Now, as I understand, Iran did import a quantity of TRR fuel shortly before those waivers were ended. So if they're operating the TRR similarly to how they've done in the past, I think they'd be okay, in the short to medium terms in terms of actually having that fuel on hand. Unfortunately, though, ending the waiver plays into Iran's justification for needing to pursue 20% enrichment and needing to pursue this new type of uranium metal fuel in order to increase efficacy for producing medical isotopes out of the Tehran research reactor. So I think it was Ken who mentioned the importance of reinstituting those non-proliferation waivers to allow projects like this to continue. And I think he's absolutely correct that this is critical both for denying Iran that justification to enrich to 20% and in terms of allowing the other parties to the JCPOA to actually fulfill their commitment. So I absolutely agree that that should be a quick step that the United States takes soon. Now, in terms of the uranium metal piece, I agree with Bob Kelly in that 20% enriched material is less of a threat in terms of enriching that to weapons grade if it's not in gas form. And that once it is transformed into metallic powder, it's difficult and timely or costly to try to kind of transform that back into gas and then enrich further. So if you have a large stockpile of 20% enriched material, and converting it to metal does decrease the proliferation risk, and it does increase then the breakout time. But the bottom line is that Iran is prohibited from engaging in uranium metal activities under the Jcpoa. So this is another violation of the Jcpoa. And Iran producing uranium metal for the TRR, could give it a capability that it argues it wants to retain, even if the Jcpoa is restored. So yes, I mean, if Iran had a large stockpile of 20% gas, turning into metal would decrease the risk, but I think it creates more challenges down the road. And as I said, any experience in uranium metal conversion, is going to give Iran, some new knowledge and that, could play into any future decision to pursue nuclear weapons. So I don't really think that it's a strong kind of non-proliferation argument when the Jcpoa, still has a chance of being restored. Regarding the role of Russia and China, I certainly think that they can play a very important role in reconstituting and continuing some of these required cooperative non-proliferation activities under the Jcpoa that have been hampered by the waivers that the United States withdrew. That means, keeping Fordo as a research site, with Russian assistance. That means, converting the Arak heavy water reactor into a less proliferation sensitive model. The Chinese are leading on that. So they certainly have a role to play, I think, particularly in that civil sphere. I'm a little bit concerned that they may be less helpful when we start talking about follow-on negotiations and what building on the Jcpoa looks like from a non-proliferation perspective. But in the short term, in terms of reestablishing confidence in the Jcpoa, sustaining the Jcpoa, I think engagement with Russia and China is certainly key.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say we have so many more questions, and unfortunately, we are getting to the bitter end. Maybe I'll go back to you, Brian, for one last one, which is about the so-called letters of comfort that might be issued by the Treasury Department that might perhaps provide some more confidence for some businesses and so on to go back into Iran. But I have to say, I think this has been one of, we always say this is a rich discussion, but I'm going to have to listen to this entire event all over again to get all of the fabulous comments that you all have made. And I see that Ambassador Ann Patterson has said something very nice about how this was such a really great discussion. So I thank you, Ambassador, for that very kind comment. So Brian, any last thoughts? And also there was a question about your paper. It's available on the Atlantic Council website. If you just Google Brian O'Toole and Atlantic Council, it should pop right up, and I will retweet it and put it back on Facebook also. And it's available, I think, when you go to the link for this event, if you want to look at the recording of it again. So final word to you, Brian.
Yeah, comfort letters, in my view, are a little bit of a kind of trap of convenience. They can be effective if you issue a comfort letter, as says the U.S. government, foreign government is going to be, or foreign bank or company is going to be fine undertaking a transaction. The problem is it's a really micro way to deal with a very macro problem. And I think, comfort letters used judiciously might be able to kind of assist in some really critical transactions, right? If there are COVID vaccines that need to get in, or particular transactions related to some of the nuclear steps that need to be undertaken from parties outside of Iran. But I would caution against putting too many eggs in that basket, because it is not a long-term solution for kind of, if you get to a deal and everybody goes away happy and there's economic relief that can be conveyed to Iran as part of that. Comfort letters are not how you make that happen. They're selective. It essentially advantages entities and governments with more connections to the U.S. government and to OFAC, who would end up issuing a lot of these things. I think more systemic kind of change needs to happen, and there needs to be kind of clear guidance, especially in the humanitarian stuff, as I mentioned earlier, that there needs to be a more effective framework that's understood globally and within the United States for how to make those types of transactions happen, and less reliance on kind of comfort letters as a crutch, because that just doesn't solve the bigger problems, even though it can maybe address some smaller things along the way. And as somebody who sat at OFAC and had to deal with comfort letters from time to time, just the administrative burden of those things is outrageous. And that's one of the reasons I say all of this, is because expecting an agency of 220, 230 individuals to affect that while they're implementing 45 other sanctions programs, including, Russia and Venezuela and China and North Korea, right? It's not in the realm of what's actually possible. So bigger change, comfort letters, and kind of very isolated incidents, and only when you absolutely need it, is kind of where I think it needs to land.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much to all of our participants, to everybody who's been tuning in from all over the world. I hope we've answered some of your questions. Obviously, it's not going to be quite as easy as we had hoped, many of us, but it clearly is also not impossible. And I think there's a lot of very constructive suggestions have been made for US action, for Iranian action, Europeans and others to get back into some semblance of diplomacy again after the last 4 years. So thank you all very much. And please stay tuned. Our next event, I think, is going to be on February 24th, and we're going to look at Iranian public opinion about the JCPOA, among other things. So thank you again, and be well.